I had always dreamed of owning my own home, and when the opportunity came to buy a house in Brookstone Heights, I jumped at it. The neighborhood was pristine, quiet, and offered a sense of community I thought only existed in movies. The houses were all beautifully designed, each one meticulously maintained, and the streets were lined with trees that seemed to burst with color during every season. It was the kind of place you could imagine yourself growing old in, where you'd wave at neighbors over freshly mowed lawns while sipping iced tea on the front porch. The Homeowners Association, HOA, as I was informed by the realtor, was there to ensure the integrity of the neighborhood. At first, that sounded great to me. Who wouldn't want a neighborhood where everyone maintained their property to the highest standard? It was clear that the HOA was the backbone of this community, and everyone seemed to adhere to its rules, from the pristine lawns to the carefully selected house colors. The first few weeks were peaceful. I spent my days unpacking and settling in, and my evenings relaxing in the warmth of my new home. The HOA sent out a few letters, mostly reminders about basic things like lawn care and garbage bin placement, but nothing that felt invasive. I was just another new homeowner, blending into the fabric of Brookstone Heights. Then came the newsletter. A brightly colored flyer slid through my mailbox one morning, advertising an upcoming HOA meeting. I skimmed through it quickly, noting the usual items: updates on community events, reminders to pick up after your dog, and what caught my eye: the announcement that the HOA had a new vice president, Karen Mitchell. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, I realized that's where the trouble began. At the next HOA meeting, I walked into the community center and immediately felt the difference. The air was tense, as if everyone was walking on eggshells. It wasn't a large group of people, maybe a dozen residents at most, but they all seemed to hang on Karen's every word. She stood at the front, poised, a thick binder clutched in her hand, as she introduced herself with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We're here to make Brookstone Heights the best it can be," Karen declared with a level of self-assuredness that made me uneasy. A neighborhood isn't just about nice houses and perfect lawns. It's about the standards we uphold. And as your new vice president, I'll be making sure we maintain those standards no matter what. There was an odd pause after she spoke, as though everyone was waiting for something. I noticed a few people nodding, but there was no real excitement in the room, only tension. When the meeting started, Karen delved straight into a list of reminders for the community. There were things I could understand, like no parking in the grass or blocking the sidewalk, but there were also bizarre restrictions that I never anticipated. For instance, we were required to submit approval for any landscaping changes, even something as simple as planting a bush in our front yard. Additionally, Karen announced that all flags, including American flags, had to adhere to a specific size and placement rule. The list seemed endless and oddly strict, but I tried to remain calm. I didn't want to rock the boat, so I didn't speak up, but I could feel a knot forming in my stomach. As the meeting continued, I began to notice a trend. Karen wasn't interested in making the neighborhood better. She wanted control. After the meeting, I went home still uneasy, but I brushed it off as the typical bureaucratic overreach that comes with any HOA. Surely, I thought, people would ignore the overly picky rules. That night, though, I received an email from the HOA. It was a reminder about the upcoming neighborhood inspection, and I was taken aback by the tone. Ensure your property is in full compliance with HOA standards. Any violations will result in fines or corrective action. I wasn't doing anything wrong. My house was perfectly maintained, but the email had an almost threatening vibe. It was subtle, but it made my skin crawl. And as I sat there staring at the screen, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this neighborhood, about Karen, was off. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't put my finger on it yet. But soon enough, I would. A few days after the HOA meeting, I started receiving regular notices in my mailbox. At first, I thought it was just the usual administrative stuff, flyers about neighborhood events or reminders about community rules. But then came the first official violation notice. It was a crisp white envelope with the HOA logo printed at the top. My stomach dropped as I tore it open, only to find a letter informing me that my grass was out of compliance. Apparently, my lawn had a few spots that were slightly overgrown. Nothing extreme, just a couple of areas near the edge of the yard that needed trimming. According to the HOA, it was a violation of their landscaping uniformity standards, and I was issued a fine of $25. I couldn't believe it. I had mowed my lawn the previous weekend, and I had a regular routine for maintaining my yard. Sure, there were a couple of patches of grass that grew faster than others, but this wasn't something that would cause any problems. Still, I didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily. I figured it was just a misunderstanding, so I decided to trim the grass in the spots they mentioned and pay the fine, just to get it over with. Maybe it was a little over the top, but I didn't want to deal with any more hassle from the HOA. That should have been the end of it, but then came another letter, and another. Each one seemed more absurd than the last. The next violation was about the placement and color of my front door mat. According to the HOA, my mat, which was a simple neutral beige with a welcome message, was inconsistent with the aesthetic standards of the community. They suggested I change it to a more neutral color. I couldn't believe what I was reading. My doormat was hardly an eyesore. It wasn't offensive. It wasn't gaudy. It was just a doormat. But the letter was clear. I had to comply or face another fine. By the time I got the third warning, this one claiming my mailbox wasn't perfectly aligned with the others in the neighborhood, I was livid. This was getting ridiculous. What was next? Would they measure the exact height of my bushes to make sure they were at the approved level? It didn't help that Karen had been lurking around the neighborhood. I started noticing her more, always walking her dog at precisely 9 a.m., clipboard in hand, inspecting every house, nodding to herself as if she were a queen surveying her kingdom. Every time I saw her, I could feel her eyes on me, as if she was waiting for me to slip up. I decided I'd had enough. I gathered the 3 violation letters, along with photos of my lawn, doormat, and mailbox, and went to the next HOA meeting. I wasn't the only one frustrated. Tim, the neighbor across the street, was dealing with his own issues. His fence had been deemed too tall, and his trees were overgrown by a few inches, a rule that seemed entirely arbitrary. When the meeting began, I stood up and spoke first. I wasn't going to sit quietly while Karen, with her smug, self-satisfied grin, ignored the community's complaints. "This is insane," I said, holding up the letters. "I've had 3 fines in the last week for the most trivial things. The HOA is harassing me for no reason." Karen didn't flinch. She was sitting in the front, as always, her arms crossed tightly. Her eyes glinted with that sense of superiority I had grown to dislike. "Perhaps you should take more pride in your property," she said in her cold, condescending tone. "Our guidelines are in place to ensure the neighborhood stays at a certain standard. If you're not willing to follow the rules, perhaps Brookstone Heights isn't the right place for you." I could feel my blood start to boil. "I'm following the rules. It's your standards that are unreasonable," I shot back. Karen's smile didn't falter. "It's not unreasonable. The standards are in place to protect our home values and ensure the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood." I could see the other neighbors shifting uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke up. Karen had managed to silence them, either through fear of fines or simple apathy. It was clear this wasn't just about maintaining property values. It was about Karen's unrelenting need for control. "Are you going to back down?" I asked her, frustrated. "I don't back down," Karen replied coolly. "If you continue to ignore the rules, you'll face more serious penalties. Fines, suspension of community privileges, even legal action if necessary." It was as if the whole meeting room held its breath. I could feel the weight of her words, the threat hanging in the air. I was furious, but I knew arguing here wasn't going to get me anywhere. The HOA had all the power, and Karen wielded it with a cold, calculating efficiency. I left the meeting seething. It was clear that Karen wasn't interested in dialogue or compromise. She was out for control, and the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. It wasn't just the fines. It was the sheer audacity of her attitude, as if she could dictate every detail of my life, my home, and my property. But I wasn't going to let her win. I had no idea what I could do, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let Karen or the HOA push me around any longer. The battle was just beginning, and I was ready for it. The weeks that followed felt like I was living in a constant state of tension. Karen and the HOA were like an unrelenting storm, battering me with rule after rule, fine after fine. At first, I tried to comply with everything, hoping that by being a good resident, I'd be left alone. But each time I met their unreasonable demands, it only encouraged them to push further. It was like they were searching for ways to control every aspect of my life. The next violation came a few days after the HOA meeting. This time, it wasn't about my lawn or mailbox. No, this time, they went after my car. It had been parked in the driveway, a reasonable place for it, but apparently, it wasn't according to the HOA's latest parking compliance update. According to the new rule, which had never been properly communicated to the residents, no car could be parked in the driveway unless it was registered as a single-vehicle household. I had 2 cars, which meant one had to be parked in the garage at all times. Even though my driveway was large and my cars were neatly parked, I had violated this mysterious new rule. I found the notice on my windshield one evening when I came home from work. Violation of parking code. Fines imposed for non-compliance. Immediate correction required. The fine was another $50, and I had to move one car into the garage or face further penalties. I was beyond frustrated. These rules were absurd, and it was starting to feel personal. Was Karen just looking for any excuse to target me? I decided to write an email asking for clarification. I hadn't received any notice of this new parking rule before, so I asked for a copy of the updated guidelines. The response I got from Karen was short, terse, and dismissive. Residents are expected to keep up with the guidelines. Ignorance of the rules is not an excuse. The fine stands, she wrote. That was it. I felt powerless, like I was being suffocated by the weight of petty bureaucracy. The fines didn't stop there. It felt like every time I turned around, there was another infraction waiting for me. One week, I got a notice that my fence had insufficient paint coverage, which, in their eyes, violated their exterior appearance standard. The next week, I received a warning about a single dandelion growing in my yard. The HOA was practically stalking my property now, finding new ways to nitpick my life into submission. It was relentless. I wasn't the only one targeted. Tim, the guy who lived across the street, was also dealing with a flurry of fines. His grass had been deemed too long, despite the fact that he mowed it twice a week. His mailbox, which was the same as everyone else's on the block, was suddenly out of compliance with the new standard for size. Tim came over one afternoon, looking like he hadn't slept in days. "This is insane, man," he said, shaking his head as we sat on my front porch. "I just got hit with another fine. They say my fence is unsightly, and it's not even that bad. It's been like that for years." "I know," I said, leaning back in my chair. "It's like they're trying to push us out. I'm telling you, Karen is targeting people she doesn't like. She has it out for me, for sure." Tim sighed. "You're not the only one. I've heard others talk about her. She's been pressuring people to sell their homes, even threatening them with fines and penalties. My neighbor, Carol, she's in her late 70s, and they sent her a letter saying her lawn wasn't perfectly manicured. She's barely able to keep up with it, but they don't care." That was it. It wasn't just about arbitrary fines anymore. Karen and the HOA were going after vulnerable people who couldn't fight back as easily, and it was clear they didn't care who they hurt in the process. I began to dig deeper. I started talking to more neighbors and gathering stories of the ways the HOA had abused its power. I even managed to get a hold of a few of the HOA's internal documents, which outlined a series of ridiculous, barely enforceable rules that no one had ever seen before. It was becoming more and more evident that Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was inventing new ones on the fly to justify her reign of control. It wasn't just my house that was under siege anymore. The whole neighborhood was starting to feel the pressure, but most people were too afraid to speak out. It was the classic HOA tactic: keep everyone in line with the constant threat of fines or worse, suspension of community privileges. That's when Tim and I decided we'd had enough. We couldn't let Karen run roughshod over our lives. We started gathering support from other homeowners, people who had been quietly suffering under the HOA's thumb, too scared to speak up. A small group of us started meeting in secret, in backyards or late at night over coffee, plotting how we could stand up to the HOA. We knew we needed more than just complaints. We needed a strategy, and we needed to hit them where it hurt, financially and legally. The HOA thought they could intimidate us into submission, but they hadn't counted on one thing. We weren't going to back down. This wasn't just about a few fines anymore. This was about standing up to a system that was being manipulated for personal gain, a system that was hurting our neighbors and poisoning the sense of community we had once loved. Karen and the HOA might have thought they were untouchable, but we were about to show them they weren't. The fight had only just begun. The tension in Brookstone Heights was reaching its boiling point. The more I learned about the HOA's shady tactics, the more I realized how deeply entrenched their control was. What started as minor annoyances and petty fines had escalated into an all-out battle for our homes, our lives, and our sanity. But the breaking point came one Tuesday afternoon when I came home to find a notice on my front door. It wasn't a fine this time. It was a threat. Due to repeated violations of the HOA's rules, a motion has been made to suspend your community privileges. Effective immediately, you're prohibited from using the community pool, clubhouse, and other shared amenities. Additionally, a formal request for a lien on your property will be submitted to the board if you do not rectify the violations within 30 days. My blood ran cold as I read the words. A lion. This wasn't just about a few fines anymore. Karen was pushing for something far more serious. If they succeeded, it could be the first step toward forcing me out of my home. I had heard rumors that this was one of the HOA's more extreme tactics, especially for people who weren't backing down like I was. I was seething. There was no way I was going to let Karen get away with this. A lion on my property, over a few minor lawn violations and an allegedly misaligned mailbox. I had never even been given a proper opportunity to dispute these issues, and now she was threatening to ruin my life over them. I grabbed my phone and called Tim immediately. "Dude, you won't believe this," I said, voice shaking with anger. "They're trying to put a lion on my house. Karen's gone too far." Tim cursed loudly on the other end of the line. "What? This is insane. They can't do that for stuff like this. We have to fight back. I'm telling you, this is personal for Karen. She's targeting you." I wasn't sure if it was personal, but it sure felt that way. I had seen her at every HOA meeting, her smug face full of control as she made every resident feel like a peon under her thumb. But now, she had crossed a line. I couldn't just sit back anymore and wait for them to destroy everything I had worked so hard for. I gathered my thoughts, trying to figure out my next move. I couldn't fight this alone, especially with the HOA's legal muscle behind them. I needed a plan, and fast. The first thing I did was get in touch with a lawyer. I had a feeling the HOA's actions might not even be legal, and I wanted to make sure I wasn't walking into a trap. The lawyer I spoke with was shocked at the HOA's overreach. "These kinds of threats are illegal in many places," the lawyer explained. "They can't just place a lion on your property for petty violations like untrimmed grass or a mailbox that doesn't meet their aesthetic standards. The HOA is supposed to work within the law, and it sounds like they're crossing some serious lines." I was relieved, but I knew the battle wasn't over. The HOA might back down if they realized I was prepared to fight, but they had the power of the community behind them, and they wouldn't give it up without a fight. I decided to take a more proactive approach. I began compiling all of the violations they had issued against me, along with any communication I had with them. I also collected testimonies from other neighbors who had been unfairly targeted, Tim, Carol, and a few others. They were all too scared to confront the HOA head-on, but they were more than willing to help if it meant standing up to Karen. Meanwhile, Karen's behavior was becoming more erratic. The more I pushed back, the more she seemed to double down. She would show up at my house unannounced, walking her dog and giving me pointed looks, as if daring me to make a mistake. I began noticing strange little things, like how my neighbors were suddenly too busy to talk when I saw them in the yard, or how the local community board members seemed to avoid eye contact when I passed them on my way to work. It was as if they had all been swept into her web of control, too scared to stand up against her. The final straw came one weekend when I was preparing to leave for the grocery store. As I backed out of my driveway, I noticed something that sent a shock of panic through me. A red sticker on my windshield. The words "Vehicle Towed, HOA Violation" were scrawled across it. What the hell? I jumped out of the car and rushed to inspect it, heart pounding. A tow truck was parked in front of my driveway, preparing to hook up my car. "Stop! What are you doing?" I yelled, rushing up to the driver. The tow truck driver, looking unimpressed, simply shrugged. "I've got orders to tow. This vehicle is in violation of HOA rules." "Are you serious?" I practically shouted. "I've been parking here for weeks, and you can't just—" "Take it up with the HOA." He interrupted coldly. "I'm just doing my job." I stood there stunned as he lifted my car onto the back of the truck. I felt my blood pressure rise as I watched it being driven away. This was it. The HOA had officially crossed the line. They were trying to push me out, to break me. But this time, I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I had a lawyer, support from my neighbors, and a new determination to fight. I was done playing by their rules. The gloves were off. The battle had just become personal, and I was ready to take down Karen and her HOA once and for all. The moment my car was towed, something inside me snapped. I was tired of being intimidated, tired of letting Karen and her HOA dictate my life. They had crossed a line that I wasn't willing to tolerate anymore, and if they thought I'd just roll over, they were about to get a harsh lesson in fighting back. The first thing I did was contact my lawyer, Mark. He was a local attorney with experience dealing with HOA disputes, and after hearing about my situation, he was just as outraged as I was. "This is completely unlawful," Mark said over the phone, sounding more serious than I'd ever heard him. "They're harassing you and going way beyond their authority. Towing your car without a proper warning is illegal, and we have a strong case to challenge this. But we're not just going to settle for that. We're going to expose them." He laid out a plan. First, we file a formal complaint with the local government agency that oversees HOAs. We'd also launch a legal challenge against the towing, and I'd be filing a counterclaim for damages caused by the wrongful removal of my car. But that was just the start. The real fight, Mark said, was going to be about exposing the HOA's abuse of power. I started gathering everything. Every fine, every email, every violation notice. It was time to build a case that would make it clear the HOA was operating outside of the law. I've been keeping meticulous records, so it wasn't hard to put it all together. I also reached out to other neighbors who had been victimized by Karen's reign of terror. Tim was on board, and Carol, the elderly woman who had been harassed about her lawn, agreed to speak up too. I could feel the momentum building as I collected more and more testimonies from people who had been too scared to say anything before. "We're with you," Tim said one evening while we were working on the case. "If we can take Karen down, we can finally take our neighborhood back." Word started to spread through the community. Slowly, more residents came forward, sharing their own stories of being fined for minor infractions, being ignored or bullied by the HOA, or being forced to comply with rules that made no sense. As the list of supporters grew, I realized just how many people had been quietly suffering under Karen's control. It wasn't just me. This was a neighborhood-wide issue. It was a pattern of abuse. To add to that, I managed to get my hands on the HOA's financials. I had always suspected something was off, and I was right. The HOA's budget showed a significant amount of money spent on legal fees and fines, with a large portion going directly to Karen's pet projects. New rules that only served to pad the HOA's coffers and increase fines for residents. It was clear now that this wasn't just about maintaining a nice neighborhood. It was a money-making scheme for Karen and her cronies. Armed with all this evidence, Mark and I decided it was time to go public. We filed the legal papers to challenge the towing, but we also contacted the local news. A small investigation into Karen's behavior seemed like the perfect way to put pressure on the HOA and expose the corruption that was taking place right under our noses. The first news segment aired a week later. The reporter, a woman named Jenna, interviewed me in my front yard. I was calm on the outside, but inside, I could feel a nervous energy buzzing through me. This was the moment we've been waiting for. We've heard from residents who say they've been harassed, fined for trivial reasons, and even had their property wrongfully towed, Jenna said into the camera. One homeowner has taken legal action against the Brookstone Heights HOA, claiming they are using their power to intimidate and extort residents. We've also uncovered evidence of financial mismanagement and self-dealing among the board members, including the vice president, Karen Mitchell. The segment went live that evening, and the community was in an uproar. I couldn't believe how quickly the story spread. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down were now talking openly about the HOA's abuses. A few of them even shared their own stories with the reporter, adding fuel to the fire. By the time the news aired, I was already receiving calls from the local authorities. They wanted to investigate the HOA's financial records and the illegal towing of my car. They were concerned about the potential for criminal activity. Karen, of course, was furious. I could see the fire in her eyes the next time I saw her on her daily walk through the neighborhood. She glared at me like she couldn't believe I had the audacity to go public. "You think you've won, don't you?" She spat at me one morning as I was walking out to my car. "No, Karen," I said with a smile I didn't even have to force. "I think we just started." Behind her, I noticed a few of the board members from the HOA walking with her. They looked uncomfortable, but none of them dared speak up. I could see the cracks starting to form in her perfect little empire. The pressure was mounting on her, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she would crack under the weight of the public scrutiny. The fight had only just begun, but the tide was turning in our favor. The HOA was no longer the powerful, untouchable entity it once was. We had hit them where it hurt, exposure, and now there was no turning back. Karen's reign of terror was coming to an end, and the people of Brookstone Heights were ready to take their neighborhood back. The moment the news segment aired, the entire dynamic of the neighborhood shifted. The once feared HOA, led by Karen, suddenly found itself under intense scrutiny. The residents who had been cowering in fear for so long began to speak out. The phone calls, emails, and social media posts were relentless. Everyone had a story to tell, and they were finally ready to share it. For the first time in ages, Karen couldn't walk through the neighborhood without hearing whispers. People who had once smiled and nodded in her presence now avoided eye contact. The silent rebellion had begun. But Karen, being the control freak she was, didn't take this sitting down. She fired off an angry email to all the homeowners, demanding that they cease and desist from participating in the media frenzy. She called the news coverage irresponsible and accused everyone involved of trying to undermine the community's values. But her words fell on deaf ears. The more she raged, the more the community seemed to rally against her. Behind the scenes, I was watching as the HOA slowly began to crack. The investigation into the towing incident was gaining traction, and the authorities were now looking into financial irregularities. Karen had made a fatal mistake by not only abusing her power, but also making personal financial gains through the HOA's budget. The lawyer I'd hired had started digging into the HOA's finances, and what we found was damning. A few weeks after the news segment, I received a phone call from Mark, my lawyer. His voice was filled with excitement. "You won't believe this, but we've got them," he said. "I've just confirmed that the HOA has been funneling fines and fees into private accounts linked to Karen and a few of the board members. It's all illegal. This is the smoking gun we've been waiting for." My heart raced. This was the break we needed. The HOA had been using residents' money for personal gain, skimming off the top, and exploiting the community for their own benefit. It wasn't just abuse of power anymore. It was criminal. I called Tim right away. "We've got them, Tim. They're finished. The HOA is done." Tim let out a triumphant cheer. "I knew it. We just needed the right evidence. This is it, man. It's over for Karen." The next few days were a whirlwind. News outlets were now covering the investigation into Karen's actions, and the pressure on the HOA intensified. Residents began coming forward with their own stories of how the HOA had illegally pocketed their fees or forced them to comply with nonsensical rules under the threat of financial ruin. The scandal was growing, and the more it grew, the more Karen tried to dig herself out. But the cracks in her facade were widening. She started scrambling, making desperate attempts to cover up the financial mismanagement and the illegal activities. Board members who had once been loyal to her started to backpedal. Some of them quietly resigned. Others, like Greg, one of her closest allies, began distancing themselves, issuing statements saying they were unaware of Karen's financial dealings and had no part in the illegal activities. The turning point came when one of the former board members, a quiet man named Bill, reached out to me. He'd been on the board during the earlier years of Karen's presidency, and he had watched the transformation from a simple neighborhood association into a profit-driven enterprise. Bill was ready to talk. "I don't know how she kept it all hidden for so long," Bill admitted when we met. "But it's all true. She's been using the HOA to line her pockets. I tried to get her to stop, but she had too much control over the board. It was either go along with her or get pushed out." Bill's testimony was crucial. He provided detailed accounts of how Karen had manipulated the financial records, diverted funds for personal projects, and even had contractors she favored paid through the HOA budget for services that were never rendered. It was over for Karen. As Bill's statements were published, the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. A criminal investigation was launched. The board members who had been complicit in the scheme were now facing charges of fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of power. The local government officials, who had been initially hesitant to get involved, were now eager to bring charges against the HOA for its illegal actions. For Karen, it was the beginning of the end. As the investigation unfolded, her once unshakable power crumbled. Neighbors who had once feared her now took every opportunity to call her out, to remind her of the damage she had caused. The community was finally reclaiming its voice. But the most satisfying moment came when Karen was called into a public hearing. Residents packed the meeting room, and the city council asked her point blank about the financial discrepancies, the towing of my car, and the countless complaints from residents. She tried to deny it all, but the evidence was overwhelming. Her facade of invincibility was shattered in front of everyone. Karen, once the proud and powerful president of the HOA, was officially removed from her position. And it didn't stop there. She was facing multiple charges for fraud and misuse of funds. The HOA, which had once been an unaccountable dictatorship, was now in disarray. But it wasn't just Karen who fell. The entire structure of the HOA began to unravel. A new, more transparent board was elected, and the focus shifted back to creating a fair, cooperative community rather than using power for personal gain. We had won, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. As for me, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The fight had been long and exhausting, but it had been worth it. Karen's reign of terror was over, and Brookstone Heights was free from her grip. But I knew that the real victory wasn't just about taking down a corrupt HOA president. It was about standing up for what was right and reminding everyone in the community that power should always come with accountability. It felt surreal as the day of the public hearing arrived. The atmosphere in Brookstone Heights was charged with an energy I hadn't felt in years. The neighborhood, once quiet and divided under Karen's iron grip, was now alive with hope. People were coming together, united in their desire for change. The fight had reached its peak, and the final showdown was about to unfold. The council chamber was packed with residents, reporters, and local officials. The air was thick with anticipation. As I walked into the room, I saw familiar faces: Tim, Carol, Bill, and even a few neighbors I had never met before. They were all here for one reason: to finally hold Karen and the corrupt HOA accountable. It was a bittersweet moment. I couldn't believe how far we'd come. The council members sat at their long table, eyeing the crowd, while Karen, now looking unusually frazzled and nervous, sat at the front with her attorney. She was no longer the confident, smug woman who had ruled over us all. The pressure was getting to her, and she knew it. This was her last stand, and she was desperate. The council president, a no-nonsense woman named Linda, called the meeting to order. The room fell silent, and I could hear the collective breath of the community held in anticipation. "We're here today," Linda began, her voice steady and authoritative, to address the serious allegations regarding the Brookstone Heights Homeowners Association and its leadership under Ms. Karen Mitchell. This includes financial mismanagement, illegal towing practices, and abuse of power. We will hear from the public and the accused, and then the council will make its decision. I could feel the weight of the moment settling in. It wasn't just Karen's fate that hung in the balance. It was the future of Brookstone Heights. We had spent too long being intimidated and pushed around, and now we were taking back control. One by one, residents stood up to share their stories. Carol, the elderly woman who had been harassed for her lawn, was the first to speak. Her voice cracked with emotion as she described how Karen and the HOA had repeatedly fined her for the most trivial of offenses. "I'm just trying to live in peace in my own home," she said, wiping away tears, "and they wouldn't let me." Next was Tim, who shared the story of how his family had been targeted for having a too loud barbecue. It wasn't the first time the HOA had made a big deal out of something minor, but this time Tim wasn't afraid to speak up. "They treated us like criminals because we wanted to spend time with our family," he said, his voice rising in frustration. "This isn't the community I thought I was moving into." Then it was my turn. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding, and stood before the council. I had spoken out many times before, but this felt different. This time, it wasn't just about me. It was about all of us. I knew that whatever I said could make or break this moment. I recounted everything that had happened, from the petty fines to the wrongful towing of my car. I spoke about the evidence we had uncovered, the financial mismanagement, the favoritism, and the lies. Karen and the HOA used their power to intimidate, manipulate, and profit at the expense of the residents. I said, my voice steady but filled with conviction. It wasn't about maintaining a nice neighborhood. It was about control, and it's time to take that control back. The room was silent as I finished, but I could see the approval in the eyes of the council members and the nods of my neighbors. We were all in this together now, and we weren't backing down. Then Karen's attorney spoke, trying to defend her actions. He claimed that everything was done within the rules, that the fines were justified, and that the towing incident was simply a misunderstanding. But his words fell flat. The evidence against them was irrefutable. The financial records, the testimonies from residents, and the legal documents detailing the illegal activities of the HOA all painted the same picture. Karen had used her position for personal gain, and she had done so with the full knowledge and approval of her cronies on the board. The final blow came when Bill, the former board member, was called to testify. He confirmed everything we had suspected. He described how Karen had manipulated the board, how she had personally pocketed money from fines and redirected funds meant for community improvements into her own projects. He even detailed how she had blackmailed board members into voting her way by threatening to expose their own personal shortcomings. The council was stunned. As Bill spoke, Karen's face flushed with anger. She looked like a woman who had realized her empire was crumbling. The walls she had so carefully built around herself were falling apart, piece by piece, and there was no way to stop it. After hours of testimony, Linda, the council president, finally called for a vote. The tension in the room was unbearable. Everyone waited in silence as the council members deliberated. When they returned, Linda addressed the room. After careful consideration, she said, her voice resolute, the council has determined that Ms. Karen Mitchell and the Brookstone Heights HOA board engaged in unlawful practices that not only violated the rights of homeowners, but also constituted financial fraud. As a result, we are formally removing Karen Mitchell from her position as HOA president, and we are dissolving the current board. The HOA will be restructured with new leadership, and we will be conducting a full audit of the association's finances. The room erupted into applause. It felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Karen was no longer in control. The reign of terror she had imposed on our community was finally over. The battle had been long and hard, but we had won. The HOA was going to be reformed, and we, the residents, would finally have a say in how our neighborhood was run. Karen's face turned red with fury, but there was nothing she could do. She had been defeated. As the crowd erupted into cheers, I couldn't help but smile. We had taken back our community. We had taken back our lives. But there was one last thing I had to do. I turned to Karen, who was standing at the front, seething with rage. "You lost, Karen," I said calmly, "and it's over. You can't control us anymore." For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was finally free. The days following the public hearing felt like a dream. The euphoria of the victory was still fresh, but as the dust settled, the reality of what had happened slowly started to sink in. Brookstone Heights was free from Karen's reign, and the community was beginning the slow process of healing. The newly elected HOA board, made up of residents who genuinely cared about the neighborhood, had already begun making changes. I spent a lot of time reflecting, walking through the streets, and noticing things I hadn't before. The neighborhood felt different, lighter, almost. People were speaking to each other again, and the tension that had once filled the air seemed to dissipate. I noticed a group of neighbors gathering at the park for an impromptu barbecue. There were no more secret fines or threats of HOA violations looming over them. They were simply enjoying each other's company, something that had been rare under Karen's watch. The new board was holding regular open meetings, and for the first time in years, people were actually attending. No longer did the HOA feel like a distant authority trying to impose rules for the sake of control. Now it was a group of neighbors working together to make the community a better place. People were excited about the changes, and it was clear that the oppressive atmosphere had been lifted. As for Karen, her downfall was just beginning. Her former allies on the board had all distanced themselves, many of them publicly expressing regret for their involvement. The city council had launched a full investigation into the financial discrepancies, and the authorities were still sifting through evidence that would eventually lead to criminal charges. Karen's life, once marked by power and control, was now in ruins. I heard through the grapevine that she had been forced to sell her home. No one was willing to buy it at market value, so she had to let it go for a fraction of what it was worth. The very community she had tried to exploit had turned against her, and now she was paying the price. A week later, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find Tim standing there with a smile on his face, holding a bottle of champagne. "We did it," he said, raising the bottle in the air. "To freedom." We toasted to our victory, and it wasn't long before the rest of the neighborhood joined in. People came over to congratulate me, offering words of thanks for taking a stand. They said it was my courage that had sparked the change, but honestly, it was the collective strength of the community that made the difference. Without each person coming forward, without the support of Tim, Carol, Bill, and everyone else who had stood up, it would have been impossible. This was our win, not just mine. But even as we celebrated, I knew the fight wasn't completely over. The HOA, as it had been, was gone, but there would always be those who would try to seize power again. The new board was still finding its footing, and I couldn't let my guard down completely. The reform had only just begun, and vigilance would be key to keeping the integrity of the community intact. Then one morning a month later, I received a letter from the new board. It was a thank you note, signed by everyone, acknowledging the hard work that had gone into fighting back against the old regime. The letter also included an invitation to join the board, to help ensure the changes stuck and that the HOA remained a fair and transparent entity. I was tempted. The idea of playing an active role in shaping the future of Brookstone Heights was appealing, but at the same time, I had already spent so much of my energy on the fight against Karen that I felt a need to step back and take a break. I politely declined, but I promised to stay involved as a volunteer whenever necessary. In the end, it wasn't just about taking down Karen or tearing apart a corrupt system. It was about regaining our community's power and voice. The neighborhood had learned a valuable lesson about standing up for what was right and the importance of transparency and accountability. And then, just when I thought everything had settled, I received a call from one of the local news outlets. They wanted to do a follow-up piece on the story, focusing on the changes in the community since the HOA's downfall. I agreed, knowing it was important to share the lessons learned with a broader audience. The reporter asked me what I thought the biggest takeaway was from everything that had happened. I paused for a moment before answering. "It's simple," I said, leaning back in my chair. "No one person should ever have too much power. A community thrives when its people are united and have a voice. Karen thought she could control us, but in the end, we controlled our own destiny. And that's a lesson I think everyone needs to hear." As I hung up the phone and looked out the window, I realized just how far we had come. The neighborhood, once divided and fearful, was now united and stronger than ever. The fight was over, but the future of Brookstone Heights had never looked brighter. And for the first time in a long time, I felt proud to call it home. Karen's reign was finished. The community had won. And as for me, I had learned that when you stand up for what's right, no matter how big or small the fight may seem, you can always make a difference.